Good evening and welcome to the Global Education Center. I'm Ellen O'Hara-Slavic, a professor of art at UNC. I will briefly introduce my exhibition and Kevin Hewison, who will then introduce Noam Chomsky. After my lecture, you're invited to visit the show Aftermath that consists of two projects. Protesting Cartography, a series of drawings of places the United States has bombed, and Hiroshima After Aftermath. Both projects, a photographic project about exposure, radiation, the A-bomb, and survival. Both projects were made in protest of war with the intent to inspire people to rethink war and to acknowledge the continuing aftermath of it. Thank you. As Howard Zinn writes in his foreword to my book, Bomb After Bomb, A Violent Cartography, when you bomb a country ruled by a tyrant, you kill the victims of the tyrant. War and the bombing that accompanies war are the ultimate terrorism, for governments can command means of destruction on a far greater scale than any terrorist group. These considerations lead me to conclude that if we care about human life, about justice, about the equal right of all children to exist, we must, in defiance of whatever we are told by those in authority, pledge ourselves to oppose all wars. I would like to thank the Center for Global Education, the Carolina Asia Center, Stephanie Nelson, Laura Greist, and everyone that helped with the show. I would especially like to thank Kevin Hewison for his invitation to exhibit my work. He came across my photographic essay on Hiroshima in the Journal of Critical Asian Studies, discovered that I was at UNC, and wanted to do a show. He also wanted to bring in a great speaker, so we are very lucky to have Noam Chomsky here tonight. Kevin Hewison is a professor in the Department of Asian Studies, the director of the Carolina Asia Center, and co-editor of the Journal of Contemporary Asia. He is the author of more than 150 publications on Southeast Asia, democratization, and globalization. Finally, I would like to thank Noam Chomsky for being here. Sorry. It's quite an honor to have him speak in conjunction with the exhibition because he's one of my heroes. I'm sure I'm not alone here tonight in the enormous respect I have for this man. And for all he knows and says and does to right wrongs, to set the historical record straight, to speak truth to power. But I will let Kevin Hewison introduce Noam Chomsky. Kevin.
Thanks, Alan. After that, I'm not going to do a long introduction. When people say our speaker needs no introduction, in this case, it's absolutely true. Everyone here knows Noam Chomsky and his work. So I just want to say a very few things. First of all, I want to thank all of the supporters of this talk and this exhibition, and I'm going to list them all. In addition to the Carolina Asia Center, of which I'm the director, we've had support from the Center for European Studies, the Center for Slavic, Eurasian and East European Studies, the Carolina Center for the Study of the Middle East and Muslim Civilizations, the Institute for the Study of the Americas, the African Studies Center, the Center for Global Initiatives, the Parr Center for Ethics, and the College of Arts and Sciences from their Global Fund. So that's pretty much everyone in the area studies side of the college. So that's really good. Noam Chomsky is Institute Professor Emeritus in the Department of Linguistics and Philosophy at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. And as you all know, he's the author of numerous books. I did a quick check on Google Scholar and found that he has 51,000 citations for his first 5 publications listed. Noam's going to speak for about 30 minutes on the topic, what we say goes, not. After that, he'll take questions. We'll field questions from the audience for about another half hour, and then you'll be invited to join us for a reception outside. So please join me in welcoming one of our greatest scholars, Noam Chomsky.
Well, the phrase, what we say goes, as you guessed, is not mine. It's a quote from President Bush #1, George H.W. Bush. That was his pronouncement in February 1991. He was celebrating the glorious victory in Iraq. Iraq was virtually destroyed by U.S. bombing. And it was maybe even a more glorious victory than Reagan's when he was, you may recall, standing tall after having sent 6,000 U.S. Special Forces to Grenada, where they overcame the resistance of 40 Cuban paramilitaries and got 8,000 Medals of Honor for their service. That was the nutmeg capital of the world. This was even grander. You know, there was actually a sort of an army, though not much of one. I'll come back to the details, but it was a moment of, in general, it was a moment of euphoria. This was not long after the fall of the Berlin Wall. It looked as though the pronouncement might actually be true. What we say goes, and the world better know it. If they don't understand it, just take a look at the wreckage of Iraq after a couple of months. What happened right after the fall of the wall is quite interesting. Should be studied more carefully than it is. One of the things that happened had to do with NATO. As you all know, NATO was sold to the West and the United States on the grounds that it was necessary to defend the West from Russian hordes, Europe and the United States. Well, the Russian hordes were gone, so people who were naive enough to believe propaganda and doctrine would have assumed that NATO would go with it. Quite the contrary, NATO expanded in an interesting way. There's very good scholarship on this, so the details are known. Mikhail Gorbachev, proposed a security system for Europe, general security system, including Russia, and he agreed to allow Germany to be unified under and incorporated in NATO, which is quite a concession, just on security grounds. Germany alone had practically destroyed Russia twice in the century, and now to allow it to join a hostile military alliance led by the global superpower, that's a significant concession. And there was, he thought, a quid pro quo. He was promised by Secretary of State James Baker and other officials that NATO would not expand to the east. The phrase was not 1 inch. It wouldn't expand to East Germany and, of course, not beyond. The United States immediately expanded NATO to the east. By now it's expanded to a global intervention force under U.S. command, and its official mission is to, among other things, to protect, to control the energy infrastructure of the world. That means pipelines, sea lanes, and so on. Gorbachev protested when NATO moved to East Germany and told Bush and Baker and Helmut Kohl, German Chancellor, that they'd had a promise to that they wouldn't extend 1 inch to the east. And he was informed by James Baker that the promise was not on paper. It was a gentleman's agreement. And if he was stupid enough to believe in a gentleman's agreement that he made with the United States, well, that's his problem, but not our problem. So that's out of history. There's a background to this. I'm not going to run through the whole history, don't worry about that, but I want to just take the first moment because the principles that were laid down during the Second World War are still operative. During the Second World War, there were high-level meetings of the State Department and the Council on Foreign Relations, the main civilian input into foreign policy, planning the post-war world. They went from 1939 to 1945. The plans are quite interesting. They're sophisticated, detailed plans about how the U.S. would run most of the world. In the early years of the war, it was assumed that it was assumed all along that the United States would end the war, that the war would end with the United States in a position of overwhelming power, replacing the former British Empire. At the beginning, it was assumed that there would be a German-run area in Asia, so there were going to be two major areas, the U.S.-run area and the German-run area. The U.S.-run area they called the Grand Area. That would include, at the very minimum, all of the Western Hemisphere, all of East Asia, and all of the former British Empire, which includes, crucially, West Asia, Middle East, where the world's major energy reserves are. As the Russian army began to grind down the Nazis after Stalingrad, the analysis changed, and the Grand Area conception expanded to include as much of Eurasia as possible. Certainly its economic and industrial heartland, Western Europe, had to include at least that. Well, that's the Grand Area. And within the Grand Area, the planners declared the United States would hold, I'm quoting now, unquestioned power with military and economic supremacy and limitation of any exercise of sovereignty by states that might challenge these global designs. That's a crucial principle. It's been operative since, it's operative now. An exercise of sovereignty is a major threat to U.S. security. It's a thesis that is very much alive today and is involved in many of today's very serious conflicts. The details were later spelled out. Most of the plans that were laid were in fact implemented in the early post-war period, which is not surprising. It was pretty much the same people in charge. And later there were further explanations. So with regard to Latin America, one of the post-war principles was that there were to be no regional alliances. Secretary of War Henry Stimson insisted on an exception to this, namely Latin America. He said, it's what he described as our little region over here, which has never disturbed anybody. There can be a regional alliance under our control. Later, the U.S. had all the power, so it did what it liked. Later, at the time, for example, when the Nixon administration was planning the overthrow of Salvador Allende, the elected government in Chile, the National Security Council argued for the necessity of this, arguing that if we can't control Latin America, how are we going to maintain stability in the rest of the world? Stability is a technical term. It means U.S. control. So, for example, leading foreign policy analyst James Chase, a liberal analyst, former editor of Foreign Affairs, explained that we were unhappily forced to destabilize Chile in order to maintain stability. And that's not a contradiction. So the comment passed without anyone noticing it because it's correct. In the technical sense, we had to preserve stability, U.S. domination. And it's crucial because how else are we going to control the rest of the world? Nixon's National Security Council recognized that allowing Europe to enter Latin America would make sense on the official grounds of keeping the Russians out, but they decided that's no good because it would interfere with stability. That is U.S. control, that is the capacity to control the rest of the world, which hinged on that. Much more significant in Latin America was the Middle East. Latin America is kind of taken for granted. The Middle East energy